I'm going to talk about embodied virtual reality, and I'll explain what I mean by that, and in particular how machine learning, interactive machine learning, as I call it, can help support that. So I'm going to present a lot of work and try to put it all into an argument rather than presenting one big paper, but that means I'm presenting here the work of a lot of people, and I don't want to take credit for that. In particular, there's a lot of work from people in my lab that I co-run with Sylvia Pan, social empathic and embodied VR lab at Goldsmiths, also with two other faculty members, Tara Collingwood-Williams and Nima Jamalian, who you'll see some work later. We are, a highly collaborative lab, so there's a lot of other people involved other than these listed here. This is just some of the collaborators that we've been involved with. And so I want to start with talking about what the virtual reality is. This picture is of someone. It's actually Christina, who will be defending her PhD next week, and we'll see her several times in this talk. So she essentially has headset on. She has two controllers. I think this is what most people think of as VR, and in particular the headset. I will kind of argue that the controllers are just as important. Broadly, this is what VR is. And there are a few other types of system that I call VR, but that's not really important. But I do think, I'll talk about what it is that makes it a really powerful medium. This page is a picture from the website of our Masters in Virtual Augmented Reality. And I thought I would illustrate some applications of VR with some of our student work, because I just like showing off my student work. So VR has been used a lot in games. So this is what it's doing is not very important, but it's a typical video game environment where you're wandering around, interacting with characters. And the big difference you'll notice, and we'll come back to this many times, really, it's the topic of the talk, is rather than a video game where you might be slouched on a couch looking at a screen, you can see the player here is actually there moving his body, doing all the actions physically. And I'll come back to the importance of that later. Come on, slip slide. This is another game, basically by our students made, loosely, basically about making IKEA furniture, which in VR, which is a lot more fun than it sounds. And well, I mean, some people love IKEA furniture, but I think one of the interesting things here again is that you're not clicking buttons. Those controls correspond to people's actual hands moving around, and really, that's the only way you can make IKEA furniture. So this is more of a sort of storytelling example. So lots of people are doing immersive animation and film, as well as games. So this is a story-based VR experience based on the story of The Little Prince, Le Petit Prince. But it's not all about entertainment. So there are many really serious applications of VR. This is an example of a student project which was training people to perform CPR. So what does CPR stand for? Resuscitation, anyway, sort of chest presses for resuscitation, and you can see they're pressing down. And again, oh, there we go. They're actually physically doing this. They're learning because they're actually physically making the action. And it's the same one. And this is another one, a more sort of therapeutic one. So this is about using VR as a way of helping people suffering from body dysmorphic disorder, and there's lots of stuff going on here, but the character you're playing has, you can see yourself in the mirror, which is obviously a big issue in dysmorphic disorder. You're interacting, like you're making decisions whether to go out or not. And this kind of swirly dust, this is these are sort of kind of good and bad demons, in the sense they're the voices telling you to be positive or negative about yourself. And so this is an example of how VR can be a very, very powerful tool in therapy. None of these examples I've shown, they're all student work, so none of them are actually practical, sort of something that is used in practice. But for example, last Thursday I was in Oxford at a VR health conference, Expo, and there's so much fantastic stuff going on in therapy, mental health, pain relief. So VR is actually a fantastic way of relieving pain during medical procedures, because it just takes you out of the environment. It's a distraction, but it's much, much more than a distraction. So I think that there's so many really powerful applications, and I won't talk too much about them today, but if anyone's interested, let me know. I mean, we can talk about that in the questions. Okay, so I'm going to define VR. Now, I'm going to take my cue from Jaron Lanier. So Jaron Lanier is actually the person who coined the term virtual reality, and he founded, I think, the first virtual reality company back in the 80s. And he wrote this really great book, Dawn of the New Everything, which is, he's a wildly eccentric individual. It's a wildly eccentric book, part life story, part speculative philosophy, part history of virtual reality. And one thing he does is that he has 51 definitions of virtual reality. And, that's, some of them are like just jokes, but actually it's kind of making a point that, that you don't need to have a single definition, and actually different definitions can help you draw attention to different aspects of something. And so I'm going to create, for this talk, a very specific definition of virtual reality. And that is that virtual reality is an embodied experience of a virtual world. What does that mean? Essentially, what that means is that the world is not real. The world is computer graphics that you're in, but your body, your real physical body, is an innate way of how you interact with it and how you experience that world. So your body is there. And, you could contrast that to a typical video game where the world is virtual, and really you're just interacting with your thumbs. That's really not what VR is. And I would say that embodied aspect is innate to it. So that's why this is my least favorite picture of VR. It's quite a famous picture, but it really is not what VR is, because as we've seen in several of the examples already, you interact with VR with your body. This is what VR is. I'm not minimizing the fact that there can be problems with VR. Absolutely, there can be, but it's not. The problem is not that we are sedentary and lying on the ground, sucked into this world. We are engaged physically with these virtual worlds. So, so this is a project done by Harry Brenton, who's up in the top right corner, or he was. So he's a friend of mine, and I helped him out a little bit with this. So this is basically dancing in virtual reality. You know, you're dancing with a virtual character. Everybody is massive, wonderful sprays of light. So it's a really nice experience, and it's very physical. And that's Tara Collingwood-Williams, who's part of our lab, who is one of the people doing the dancing. So how do we do this? How does this all work? Well, this is Christina again. I told you she'd come up. The next time she comes up, it will be her work. Actually, maybe not. It might be another version of the slide, but we will see her work, a lot of her work later. So this is, you know, there's essentially lots of sensors. So the easiest thing to think about in VR is that you've got a display on your head, but actually a lot of the power comes from sensors. So you've got a head tracker. It'll be an IMU, gyroscope, but also long-range tracking. So most modern headsets use something called inside-out tracking, which means they've got cameras pointing outwards, and those cameras basically sense the environment. They do a slam, if you know what that means, and they basically use that clever computer vision to work out where the headset is in the environment and move it. There were some other headsets like this, the Vive, use external tracking, which probably works a little bit better. It's a bit more powerful, but you know, you have to have stuff attached to your cameras attached to your walls, so it's less convenient. There's also hand tracking, which tends to use the same technology. So typically you'll have controllers that have 6 degrees of freedom. So rotation and position. Your head should have 6 degrees of freedom. Your controllers should have 6 degrees of freedom, so they can move around and track where your hands are. More recent VR headsets can track your hands directly without controllers and track your fingers. So like the Oculus Quest. And then there's, you know, other sensors like, you know, they all have a microphone on them so you can sense voice. Many headsets have eye tracking, so you can tell where you're looking. Sometimes we track physiological signals. So there's a lot of sensors on your body, and VR is making use of them to allow you to interact, to bring your body to the virtual world, as I've said. Okay, so what am I going to talk about today? I'll talk about the body in VR and show a whole host of examples quite quickly. I can follow up on any of them if you're interested. Then I'm going to talk about how does AI come into this? What's AI useful for here? And then I'm going to sort of finish with some thoughts on the implications of the work for for AI itself. Okay, so let's start with the body and VR. And there's various aspects of this. I'm going to start with how we interact with VR. And VR has one very basic interaction that essentially makes it all. That basic interaction is that you've got a head tracker on your head. As you move your head and as you turn your head, the display updates so that where you're turning your head is where you're looking. So basically, if I look this way, I'm looking at my camera. If I look this way, I'm looking out of the window that you can't see. And I mean, that's so obvious. It's trivial for us in real reality. But what VR does is it reproduces that in virtual reality. So in this virtual world, and you move your head, I can move my head forward, I can move it back. I just remember introducing someone for the first time to VR and was asked, how do you zoom in VR? And I said, like, well, you move closer. You step closer and you look closer. And, you know, that's how we interact with the real world. And that makes it feel as if you were in another place. It creates what we call place illusion. So this, I'm going to describes the 3 illusions of VR that Mel Slater, my former PI, described in a bunch of papers. This is the most recent version of it. And you know, the 3 things that really underpin everything. And this place illusion is the illusion of being in the place depicted in VR. You're there, in spite of the sure knowledge that you're definitely not there. Okay, you're definitely sitting in a lab or in a living room somewhere. You're definitely not on the edge of a cliff really high up, but you're still going to get scared and feel like you're about to sort of throw yourself off a cliff. So that's the most fundamental illusion of VR. And each of these illusions is associated with something that causes that. And that cause is the basic relationship, the low-level relationship between your senses and how you're moving, what's called sensory motor contingencies. So as I move my head, my senses change. As I turn my head, what I see changes. That's trivial, as I said. In the real world, this happens in VR. Okay, then we can get into sort of some more complex interactions. I'll be kind of throwing out a few of these. So, for example, haptics. So this is Janet Gibbs's work. If you basically people had a stick in their hand and they had either they saw a ball bouncing on it or they felt some vibration in their two hands that correspond to a ball bouncing somewhere in there, or they felt both. And having this realistic haptic, so both the fact that there's if you're not familiar with the term haptics, sorry, haptics means touch-based interaction, touch-based displays. So if you're feeling something, physical touch, movement, as well as the vision, it increases your sense of presence, which is this idea of being there, being in this virtual world. So more complex senses of ways of interacting that really make use of the body. So touch is a really important sense. So it's, VR should be more than just about vision. This is another example looking at hand tracking. I think I mentioned earlier that modern VR sensors can track your hands directly rather than having controllers. And Nima Jamalian did some work on, what's the impact of using hand tracking versus sensors on a memory game. So he's testing basically cognitive loads. So was having to work with one or the other placing more cognitive load and therefore making you worse at memory? And the answer was yes. Using direct hand tracking was people were better at memory, and that we hypothesized that was because there was less cognitive load on them. They also more freely used both hands, whereas with the controller they tended to use one hand, which is quite interesting. So these forms of interaction lead to, are really about interacting with VR as if it was the real world. So having the same interactions. So one thing I didn't mention is if you've used a lot of VR experiences get you to push buttons by shooting a ray out of your hand or out of your controller and then clicking. In Nima's experiment, you actually were pressing the button. And to me, based on this next slide, that's a much better way of doing it because that's how we interact with the real world. So plausibility is the illusion that events in the VR world are actually happening, that what's perceived is happening, again, in spite of the knowledge that events are digitally generated and nothing that is apparently happening is actually happening. So stuff, it's not there, there are no buttons there, but we feel that I'm pressing a button. And the core cause of that is the fact that the world is responding to our actions. So, as I move, I press something, the button presses just as if it was a real button in the real world. And the more our interaction is like the real world, we hypothesize, the better this will be. Okay. That's the basic interaction. I'll now come to another aspect, body ownership. So what's body ownership? It's the illusion that a virtual body is your own body. So in VR, we are in a virtual world, but you could also have a body in that world. And that has the interesting effect that as well as being someone else, somewhere else, you can be someone else. And there's lots of big impacts on this. I'll talk about it, maybe mention a couple of the impacts in a minute. So this is an example of some work led by Dorothy Cowie's lab in Durham that I was helping out on, looking particularly at children. So will children accept a body, a virtual hand as their own hand? And there's been a lot of work in this area. And this came from, if anyone's familiar with it, the rubber hand illusion. This is an illusion where you can be made to feel as if you're a sort of rubber joke shop hand is a real hand. Here, it's a virtual hand, and this virtual hand moves around, and you're grabbing things. And I won't go into the results very much, but if the hand was moving around in the same way as your hand was, then most people felt that it was their hand. So the hand was moving. If you see the slide, the two conditions in the graphs, async means the hand was moving asynchronously with your hand, so it wasn't moving with your hand. Sync means it was synchronized with your hand. There was also two forms, so it's either a hand or this cross block. And actually, for the kids involved, which is different from adults, they didn't really distinguish. They didn't feel it was different, other than that they felt the block was a tool, whereas the hand was part of their body. But it didn't affect their sense that it was their hand. So that was quite interesting. And we're continuing this work now with a new ESRC grant. It can also, that was just a hand, but you can absolutely do with this with full bodies. So Tara Collingwood-Williams did a study where we were looking at collaborating in VR with either everybody had an avatar, so had a body, or they didn't have a body. And the impacts were quite complicated, but we found that having a body had a positive effect, but the biggest positive effect was having the same condition. So if one person has a body and the other doesn't, that created problems in the social interaction. Sculpture that you made, the lights go behind, you will not watch. Hi, I've got a bit of feedback. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so that's some examples where you can be in a body, and not by our lab, but there have been results that have shown that embodying yourself in a white person in a dark-skinned avatar can reduce implicit racism. Similarly, in Spain, in Barcelona, Catalonia, they are using an embodiment scenario where in which former domestic abusers enter experience a domestic abuse scenario from the point of view of a victim, and that's actually being used currently in rehabilitation programs. I'm not talking about the biggest societal impacts of this at the moment, but they can be huge. Actually, I maybe I will just briefly, because this is a study, it's not quite published yet, but this is a study where we're training social workers in Switzerland, and they are they're embodied as a child within a domestic abuse scenario. So these are two master students who did this, and so it's to encourage social workers to think about children within the context of domestic abuse in families. Okay, the last bit I want to talk about bodies is social interaction. So we've kind of already started to get there, but this is an example of some work. This is Christina's work, who we've seen in the video, in the photos. This is one of the papers that I'll be presenting of hers. She looked at the impact, and this is a collaboration with Research Cambridge. So Marta Vilkoviak and Sean Rintel. We looked at the impact of avatars, cartoon versus realistic avatars, over quite a long, a 2-week longitudinal study. So Microsoft employees doing real, actual meetings this is actually mixed reality, so a mixture of real and virtual. And they, I mean, there's lots of interesting results here, but the appearance of the avatars was really important. So people initially trusted more realistic avatars. They felt that there were nonverbal, their sort of body language was more reliable than cartoon avatars. And that body language was very important, but it was the same body language. There was no difference. So actually, in some ways, their trust went down further because actually they realized that they were kind of overly believing in the realism of the avatars. So sort of that's an interesting. It's an effect we found, going back 20 years or so, that overly realistic avatars can bring excessive expectations, and that often, a lot of the time, it's not the visual realism, but it's the behavioral realism. So it's the body language of the avatars in the social context that is important. And different technologies support different body language. So I talked about eye tracking. If you don't have eye tracking, you can't really make eye contact. If you don't have hand tracking, you can't gesture. I think this is a really important bit. I will just put this slide up. This is from Drawdown, which is a project looking at climate change solutions. And of the 50 they used, one of these was telepresence. So the ability to use technologies like VR to replace expensive and carbon expensive travel. So not the most impactful method, but it's the one I have most expertise in. So I'm going to go for that. And this is back to Nadine. I thought I'd mention your work here. Not all of this social interaction is between real people, so we can interact with virtual people, and there's lots of work we've done with virtual people, but this is work at UCL with Antonia Hamilton and Jamie Ward and Nadine, where she looked at, you're probably familiar with this, but she found that realistic body language, in this case nodding, had a positive impact on the ratings of a character. So again, back to my same kind of idea that this is about, body movements in social VR are really important. Okay, so what's any of this got to do with AI? So I suppose virtual characters they are AIs in the sense that they are sort of controlled by computers, but here really I'm talking about machine learning, which is kind of commonly being used synonymously with AI, and I normally prefer the term machine learning because I think it's a bit more specific. So what has that got to do with anything that I've been talking about today? Well, it all comes down to embodied knowledge. So we as humans, we know how to move. We have lots of skills to do with movement. So everything I've essentially been describing has been a movement skill, whether a really basic one like turning your head that we learn in the first few weeks of life, to much more complex skills that we have to learn as adults like CPR, to social body language, which is this massively complex underpinning of our entire society in a certain sense. But one of the interesting features of that is that we have a lot of knowledge of how to do things, but that we cannot put into words. And the classic example of this is riding a bike. So if you know how to ride a bike, you know how to ride a bike. That doesn't mean you can explain to me how you ride a bike. What movements you are doing with your feet, with your hands, with your whole body. You could make a rough statement about pedaling with your feet and turning the handlebar, but exactly how you move your feet to turn, how you adjust things, and in particular, how you keep balance on a bike, these are all very complex, difficult things. And we can't really, express those into words. They're learned at a sort of linguistic level. And, this applies to a lot of what we do. Again, if you're talking about body language, the reason we have labs that study body language is because we don't know explicitly what we're doing when we're interacting with other people. And all this means is that if you can't put it into words, you definitely can't put it into code. You can't sort of generate explicit rules. Now, there's been a sort of movement in the last 10 years or so focusing on use of the body in design and interaction design. So there's this phrase I like, embodied sketching by Elena Marquez Segura. I should probably have put up some slides about Kia Herck's group in Stockholm. There's a lot of really interesting work going on here. Don't ask me exactly what they're doing in this picture, but it does show that they're using their bodies in part of this process. So, and I think this is really interesting, sort of you can't really design for body movement with a pencil and paper. You have to feel what it's like to do that movement, especially if you're making quite complex movements. But the trouble is you can spend days doing all sorts of wonderful embodied design work and physically sort of mocking up how you would work, and then to implement it you have to sit at the keyboard and start coding. So this was the problem we identified, and we created this project which was funded by the EPSRC and had a host of a lot of people. So I'll briefly go left to right, top to bottom. So the top of the Nicola Plant, Clarice Hilton, who were researchers on the project, Carlos Gonzalez Diaz, who's strictly not funded by the project, but his PhD was aligned to it. Then on the bottom, Ruth Gibson of Coventry University and an independent artist working with her partner, Bruno Martelli, who's the next person along. Rebecca Feebrink, long-term expert on interaction and the HCI of machine learning, who is at University Arts London, Creative Computing Institute, together with Phoenix Perry, the next person along, who's a game designer specializing in physical body-based movement in games. Mike Zhibnitsky at Goldsmith, who is a musician and expert in music technology, but also machine learning, and that's me on the end. Okay, so there's a whole host of us working on this, and what we did is develop a machine learning tool. So what machine learning gives you in this context is that you can, rather than having to code stuff. So machine learning, I hope you're probably more familiar with it, but machine learning is essentially a technology which allows you to define basically algorithms, computational processes by examples. So you design or create a program that can recognize faces by showing a whole host of examples of faces. So that's basically how it works, rather than trying to explicitly create rules. And we're trying to do the same for movement interaction design. So the idea is that you will perform directly examples of movement, and this is how you set everything up. You will record examples of you doing a particular movement and another movement, and then that will map into controlling aspects within a VR world. So this is all a plug-in to Unity, if you're familiar with Unity, which is probably the most used VR engine, game engine and VR engine. So this is, this is quite an old video actually. We've got more exciting examples, but it allows you to create these kind of movement-based interactions. And then, so the basic idea is that you record movement data as examples and train the machine learning algorithm and model. So that, it's a standard machine learning, supervised machine learning process. If you're familiar with that terminology, it doesn't matter if you're not. But what we're doing is really, rather than seeing it as this huge, big offline batch process done on servers by machine learning engineers, seeing this as a design tool used by creative people, dancers, artists. So we have this mechanism. We created a graph-based interface, so it's kind of no codes involved. So you set up these graphs that basically, what this does is sets up the structure of the machine learning. So in particular, like what are the inputs, what are the outputs of the machine learning? And I won't go into details. You can select different algorithms that do different things. I'll come back to you later. A really important thing is feature extractor. So what is the data you're extracting? So if I'm waving my hand around, are you getting the position of the hand, the rotation of the hand, the position of the hand relative to my head, the position, there's lots of different things you can do. We'll come back to that, why that's important later. And another aspect of the project is that this wasn't just about building a technology platform. This was really about co-designing the process and the technology. So it was really not just that, we spent a lot of time looking at how people physically design stuff. So we use the term body storming. This is quite a common term now. So if brainstorming is about coming up with ideas, in quite an abstract way, then body storming is using your body in that creative process to come up with physical embodied movement ideas. So we kind of designed this loop of training, of body storming as a starting point, then moving relatively seamlessly into training, because in the training you're not sitting typing, you're still acting out. Then you're testing, where you're still performing physically, and then if something doesn't work, you either need to add more training data, or you go back to the drawing board and start, which is not the drawing board, it's the dance floor or whatever, and start body storming again. So we did a whole host of hackathons and workshops with artists, game creators, and we funded 3 artist residencies to work with us using the platform. So for example, Bushra Burj developed a Bengali dance experience based on Bengali street dance, using custom sensors and mapping into the virtual world, whereas Sara Torelli and Sergio Bromberg looked more at actually the process of machine learning, and sort of, actually looked at what aspects of movement would identify you as human. So I'll come back to these results later. Actually, I haven't got much time, but basically, the interesting outcome was that people could do this quite readily. They picked up the basic idea of machine learning. They were able to do it, but then there were a bunch of conceptual gaps, and I'll come back to that, sort of between how people understand movement in an embodied way and how the computers understand movement. So the next example, I'll run through this very quickly, is social characters, social agents. So we alluded to this with Nadine's work, looking at how we interact with computer-controlled characters, but machine learning has a lot of potential here as well. So, I've done various experiments over many years, which looked at how we can capture data of people in real social interactions. 2 people, synchronize that data, use a machine learning model to create a character, basically sort of a model that will control a character that interacts with a real human. So, and this is the work at UCL again, capturing some data for that. But we did an industry-based project based on this idea, with 2 games companies, Maze Theory and Dream Reality Interactive. Again, this is Christina's work, who's the person who looks cool in VR. Okay, and so in this example, it wasn't actually, oops, what have I done? So I'll show you an example. So this is interacting with the character. The basic idea is we're not capturing two real people. We're capturing a person interacting with a character, and then so this is somebody having a conversation with a virtual character. They can do kind of game-like things. Typical gamers would just throw the furniture around, whereas some people will be encouraged to engage properly with characters as if they were a human being, and so we sort of primed them in different ways to do one or the other. And this bit is here, what's happening is that this is a game designer is actually annotating the data. So we have part of the creative process of the data annotation to saying, well, this is how I want the character to behave. If the person's doing this, I want the character to do this. It's a little bit more complicated than that because it's actually a bit simpler than that, but essentially that's the idea. And then I won't go into the details of the machine learning algorithms, but that's the essential process, is that we have social body language interaction based on real interaction. It's a creative process. It's a game. It's a creative artifact. So the creative director has to be in control. They're the person that's annotated it. I've kind of said this, haven't I? So you record some data, annotate that data. That data annotation is immersive. You're in there. You've got a character. The character is represented quite simply by head and hands because that's the only data we have of the character. And you've got the creative director has a button for pressing stuff for annotation. Then we train a model, and once the model's there, it can be used in practice and tested. Okay, I will very quickly try to talk a little bit about why this is interesting from the point of view of AI, if I'm an AI person. So coming back to this idea that we know things that we can't put into words, but we can put into examples. Now, this is true, and it also isn't true. So to take a different example, if you look at sort of yoga class, it's quite hard as a beginning yoga student to really put into words what you're supposed to do and how it's supposed to feel. But expert yoga instructors are able to talk about that, and I'll come back to why that is. So there are ways of doing this, but what happens is that you hardly ever cases where somebody has to earn work by pure trial and error. Even riding a bike, someone will start teaching you how to ride a bike. So they can show you, and let's go to the yoga class, this is a better example. They'll show you the pose, and they'll explain what you're supposed to do. So you're doing, lift up your leg, and you're supposed to feel a stretch in your other leg. Then the student does something, and the teacher says, yes, that's right. Oh, no, you need to do something a little bit different. And this is based on a model by Donald Schurn, the reflective practitioner. But the complexity comes about this fact that we can't quite express it in words. And in particular, when you are a beginner, you don't understand and you cannot understand what an expert is talking about. So Schurn talks about this in terms of architects, but you can think of it as yoga instructors. So yoga instructors say things like, when was the last time I was in a yoga class? So stretch up through your sternum or something like that. And I don't know what that means. What am I supposed to? How's that supposed to feel? What is that? How am I supposed to make that movement? So what actually has to happen when you're teaching, and this is common to all teaching, but particularly physical skills, is that, you have this backwards and forwards of, two people who don't really, who are incapable of understanding each other, trying to get to a stage where they can understand each other. And that involves a lot of reflection and thought on both parts. And you have to think sort of, well, what has the student understood? Or how can I put this in other words? And the student's saying, well, is this right? Is this what it feels like to push up to my sternum? And the teacher might say, yes, you're doing it right now. And, that's what it is now. So it's about learning these relationships between words and physical sensations that you can't initially put into words. There's this very complex interaction, Luke. And what I'm going to say is that there's something similar going on in VR. So I mentioned earlier that there's a bunch of gaps in understanding between what happens physically, between sort of our physical embodied understanding of a movement and what a computer understands. So let me go back. So this is exemplified by the idea of features. So a feature, if you're not familiar with machine learning, is basically a representation of the data. How's the data represented? How is my hand represented in VR? Well, I could represent the position of your hand, so that little cross, but maybe that isn't enough. What matters is how I'm twisting my hand. So if I'm doing a tennis serve, the rotation of my hand is as important, if not more, than the position of my hand. And then you get into all sorts of complicated stuff. It's position relative to what? Relative to the world? That's almost never a useful feature. Relative to my head, relative to the floor, lots of different things. So there's this mismatch, between what humans understand. We almost never would think in terms of the kind of data features that computers would use, even if we kind of understand what rotation and position means. What we actually mean by them is very different. And stuff like coordinate systems and frames of reference are like, how we work with them is very informal and kind of switches quite constantly, whereas computers, it has to be very formal and well defined. So we have these mismatches. And so what I'm proposing is that really our interactions with machine learning algorithms are quite similar to this kind of process that I've just been talking about between a yoga teacher and a yoga student, that the software has to learn the concept. So if I'm doing a backhand and a forehand in tennis, I'm trying to train the software to learn that. Then, I need to be able to teach. The software needs to learn that. That's the point of machine learning, right? It has to learn what these things I'm talking about are. But also, as a designer, I need to understand how the software is interpreting it. So what do these features mean? So what does the computer understand when I'm moving my hand this way in terms of research and position? So I have to start thinking more like a computer, and the computer has to start thinking more like a human, or more like me, not any old human, more like me. And I have to think more like that specific algorithm. So I think there's this kind of cycle, deeply interactive cycle of learning on both sides that I think is very interesting. So to sum up, machine learning can help us design for embodied and tacit. Tacit just means you can't put it into words, knowledge. That's what I've just said, and that's a good underpinning for VR. But communicating embodied knowledge between people and machines, but also simply between people, is complex and needs a complex interactive cycle, because there's kind of a gap, because by definition, we can't put it into words. And I think this is, I'm just going to end this with a boring answer, that this is where we need to look at very carefully at human-centered machine learning research. So how people interact with machine learning algorithms and use them. And I think I'm going to stop there.